Hey everybody, welcome back to Brick System Brothers. My name's Nathan Masters. About a month ago, I had the good fortune to be able to travel to Europe. I spent about a week in Luxembourg, and the main point of the trip was not to talk about Lego and think about Lego, but of course, I could not help thinking about some things during the trip and afterwards as well. So I actually have three topics that I want to make a video, separate video on each one. And today's part one, and just really take a brief look at the impact of Lego as a global brand and some of the things that got me thinking why I was actually still in Europe, and then also things that I have been thinking about since I got back in terms of Lego being a global brand. Just from a mile-high overview, like the idea of the culture you live in shaping your expectations of how things look and interact, and specifically in the sense of Lego, how Lego products were designed, especially earlier when they were started in Denmark and were mainly a European-centric company. Their products looking very European. Later, as they got to be more of a global brand, how they adjusted some of the way that their products looked, some of the different licenses that they picked up to start to market to more cultures and other cultures. And I think something that I had noticed, even going back many years, were how Lego trains looked really different from each other in terms of passenger trains. A lot of the passenger trains I remember from my childhood that Lego had on offer at the time were the bullet style trains, which we don't have here in the US, and it looked foreign to me, and I didn't really get why those were the trains that they were offering. And that changed a little bit in the early 2000s when they did the Mile and Train line. And the Mile and Train line was more of an American-centric train theme, where they had the steam engines that we would be more familiar with in America. Of course, the steam engine, the general shape of the steam engine, is not limited to the US, but also the passenger coaches, the caboose that they did, some of the cargo hoppers, all of the Mile and Train theme to me looked very American-centric and was much more familiar with what I had seen before. And so that was the side of the product catalog in the train theme that appealed to me as a kid growing up. And those were the trains I was familiar with. Those looked like the trains that I wanted to have in my city. And not so much with the European style trains. Even the cargo trains, I did end up getting one of the World City trains. So that was actually one of my first bigger Lego sets. I believe it's a 2003 set. It's a cargo train. But there were a couple of different types of cargo trains that Lego had before they started offering the ones that look like the GM trains that we have. I think the Dash 9s are pretty common here. Before they had those style trains, which they did do later, they had kind of the rectangular with the enclosed cab at the front of the train, and then the one that I ended up getting from the World City line was kind of the long nose. It looked more like an Alco style train. And even those two didn't necessarily see a lot of in the US. Later Lego did BNSF cargo train. They did actually the Maersk loading and unloading with the container cars, and those are the trains that looked much more familiar to me with kind of the cab style, the high hood style of the cab, and the engine compartment being behind that on the rest of the chassis. Then they had the factory train, and that was really the one that kind of encompassed the most different styles that you could find in one set. Of course, that was the point of the factory train set, was to cover all those different styles. They had the crocodile, and some of the other ones on the box were definitely Europe Central trains, but I think there was also the opportunity to explore more of the American side of rail. So that's what I remember growing up from what Lego had on offer just in the train sector. And of course this would extend to their vehicles, their buildings, pretty much everything Lego did before they had a lot of the franchise tie-in and a lot of the licensing tie-ins was built on company culture that goes back to Europe and specifically Denmark. And that is what kind of clicked in my head after I had been in Luxembourg for a few days, walking around and just looking at how the city was set up, how the public transportation worked and how it looked. I realized that I had already learned a lot about European culture that I didn't even realize just because of what Lego had on offer and what I saw in the catalogs growing up. Not even sets that I had bought, just like seeing how they presented the marketing side of their set with the minifigures, with the train stations, with the way that they design their products from a European culture. And I was looking at it from an American culture. And I didn't necessarily realize at that time how it was more of a subconscious thing that once I got to Europe last month and started thinking about it more, that's when it finally clicked. I thought that was really interesting. So before the 90s, really about 2000, a lot of stuff that Lego did was more original in terms of they didn't have licensing agreements with other outside companies. An exception to that would be Shell, and so I remember some of the sets from maybe the late 90s into the early 2000s. They had a partnership with Shell to do some gas stations and some vehicles. I think nowadays they're actually using their in-house brand, which is Octane, for their fuel stuff. But that would be an example of a licensing agreement that they really started to branch out and show how Lego would be adapted to different cultures. And that would be a real world example. I think you also see this in licenses like the Star Wars line, Harry Potter, Jurassic Park, Disney, and you could go on and see what other licenses Lego is doing these days. But each of those fictional licenses were developed in a different culture. And so Star Wars is a lot of American culture wrapped up in, the space fantasy genre, which does separate it a little bit from things that are more rooted in American culture. But I think a lot of times it does still bleed through. Harry Potter, of course, being British, and so you see a lot of British things that have become part of the Harry Potter theme, and keeping with the source material there. A lot of locations are British and English. Jurassic Park would be an American theme, so the vehicles in Jurassic Park, the characters and the building styles, even though it's a fictional theme, a lot of aspects of American culture are baked into it. And so now that Lego is doing these themes, and they're not as much focused on some of their original lines, going back to like the 80s and the 90s, a lot of the powerhouse products that Lego was putting out in the 80s and 90s were focused on town, like day-to-day slice of life. If I wasn't there, but that's the impression that I get from the catalogs from that era, some of the sets that people remember the most from that era, and then maybe towards the end of that, when Lego got into their Classic Space line, that was very popular as well. But even before like Classic Space, and almost back before the minifigure, just looking at what Lego was doing was very European-centric, and that makes sense because, again, they were started in Denmark, and that is where the inspiration for their designs came from, was from the world around them. If Lego had been started in the US, I think we would have seen that in their products before they became a global brand. So that was the main thoughts that I had for this video, and like I said, just as a kid, looking through the Lego catalogs and looking at the different product lines that Lego is offering, specifically thinking about those trains and thinking, well, why would I want this passenger train that doesn't look like anything I've seen here in the US? I hadn't been to Europe. I didn't watch a lot of European shows, or I wasn't necessarily as exposed to European culture. and so there was not as much of a draw to those aspects of the Lego catalog. I didn't necessarily understand why they looked like they did and how I would have played with them if I had got them in the same way that I did with things like the Mile and Train line. That was very clear cut. You know, the Western theme goes back to a lot more of the American culture that I was more familiar with. So yeah, and I don't know, just as a closing thought here, I don't know if this only works one way. Like, if people that grew up with Lego, aside from the American themes that are now part of Lego's catalog, I don't think they necessarily would have had the same, you know, subconscious understanding of Lego products, because if they grew up in a European culture, that's kind of where it already was, and so to them it just looked like a normal passenger train, and the things that were off or different were some of the things that they started introducing later, after the 90s and the early 2000s. And of course now with all of the licenses and the tie-ins, you really have this huge mesh of different cultures coming together. And even one of their original themes right now, Ninjago, is actually focused more on an Eastern fictional culture. So things like that that have changed in the last 20 years or so are a little bit different, but you know, before that I don't think you necessarily would have had the same backwards compatible situation if you had already been part of a European culture. I think Lego to you would have looked more normal and more, you know, it just made sense, and you wouldn't have even thought about it as a kid, in the same way that I didn't think about it until I realized walking around in Europe. It was like, oh, all the symbols on, you know, Lego's fictional transportation companies are actually not that fictional, that I actually saw stuff on road signs that I had only seen on a Lego set before. And it was just really interesting to walk around and see those aspects of my childhood that before were just like a fictional part of Lego that didn't have a tie-in or an existence in real life. They were actually there all along in Europe, and I just hadn't been to Europe to see it. So that is part one. There's two other things that I wanted to cover at some point concerning the trip in Europe, and I'll look for those videos a little bit later. But yeah, that would be just some thoughts that I had on the impact of Lego as a global brand. And if you are from a European-centric culture and you grew up and you remember, you know, Lego a little bit differently, or you were just like, everything in this catalog looks familiar because that's how I grew up, it'd be interesting to hear your perspective. Drop a comment down below. And thanks for watching today, guys. We'll see you next time on Brick System Brothers. One moment. It's the gate.